We continue now at the top of Daf Samech and Beis Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 68b. And the previous Amud, the Gemara said that the pasuk of V'chol Zor Lo Yochal Kodesh, that teaches us that if you have a situation of a Bas Kohen and she marries a Yisrael, so then she's not allowed to eat Truma. And so the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Ahumi boile legufe, isn't that needed for what it itself is talking about? As Rashi over here says, Haimi boile legufe, lezar gomer, we're talking about a non-Kohen can't eat Truma. Aval hach delav zari, it's trichu vas Kohen lasra. The idea that a woman who's not a zara, meaning she's a Kohenes and she marries a zar, isn't that needed from the other pasuk of ubas Kohen? So that pasuk is needed for that. So again, according to that, we still do not have a pasuk to teach us this idea that if a woman has relations with somebody who she's puzzled to, that pasels her from kahuna and that pasels her from truma. And so the Gemara answers to that, Shrei v'chol zar ksivi. It actually says v'chol zar 2 times. Rashi over here says, Shrei v'chol zar ksivi, v'chol zar lo yochal kodesh. First of all, the pasuk we quoted before of v'chol zar lo yochal kodesh. V'yor gavi bas kohen ksiv, also by bas kohen it says, v'shava el milechem avia tochel v'chol zar lo yochal bo. It uses the same similar kind of language, v'chol zar lo yochal bo over there. U'meihacha tepuk lav lebas kohen hanisas li Yisrael la'osra tachas bal l'truma. That's where we learn out that if a bas kohen marries a Yisrael, so when she's married to her husband, while she's married to her husband, she cannot have truma. But the Gemara continues, but still, isn't that pasuk needed? Isn't that needed for what Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina teaches us? As Rashi over here says, the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina v'peraka ara lahatir onein b'truma. Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina uses this pasuk to allow an onein to eat truma, and that's the following teaching. The Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, because Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina said, v'chol zar, the pasuk says all zar, means to say zarus amarti loch. This is only true by zar, v'lo aninos. It's not true by aninos, meaning an onein is allowed to have truma. And so the Gemara answers to that, no, the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina min zar v'chol zar nafko. What Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina is learning from is the fact that it could have said zar and instead it says v'chol zar, so that extra word, that's what teaches us to exclude aninos. But again, we still have this pasuk available to teach us this halacha, that if the Kohenes marries the Yisrael, she cannot have truma. But the Gemara continues, v'akatimi boile, but still that first pasuk that we brought, it's still needed for the following. Rashi over here explains, v'akati haide bas kohen kisi. The original pasuk on the previous Amud that was quoted was Bas Kohen Kisiya, and that pasuk, the Gemara said again, teaches us that if you have a situation where they have relations with somebody who they are puzzled to, that puzzles them from Truma and Kahuna. But that's already needed for something else. Mi boy leila likuchim gemurim. It's needed for a situation of likuchim gemurim, meaning you have an actual marriage, a regular marriage. Ulashmirin, to teach us the following: Kishi chozeres lebeis avia b'misas habal, that when she returns to her father's house when her husband dies, and she doesn't have any children, and we say she can return and eat truma, it's only true about truma. She does not return, she's not allowed to eat the chaz and the shok of a carbon shlamim, like her other sisters that are allowed to eat that. It says you, the Kohen, and your sons and your daughters can have the chaz of a shok, but that does not apply to a woman who returns to Beis Avia. So that's really what that pasuk comes for. It's not to tell us this halacha that somebody who has relations with somebody she's puzzled to gets puzzled from truma and kahuna. Again, as the Gemara says, l'chidatanya, isn't the pasuk needed for the following brisa? Keshi chozeres letruma. When she returns to her father's house, she only returns for truma. Ve'ena chozeres lechazav v'shok. She doesn't return to the chaz and the shok. V'yomer Rav Chisda Amar Ravina bar Rav Shila, and Rav Chisda says in the name of Ravina bar Rav Shila, Ma'ikra, what is the pasuk that teaches us this? Techsiv, because the pasuk says, Uvas Kohen kisiel ishzar, he betrumas hakadoshim lo sochel. It says if you have a bas Kohen, she marries a zar, she is not allowed to eat the truma. Lo sochel b'mura min hakadoshim, and we understand that it means she can't eat from that which is lifted from the kodshim, meaning to say again, the idea of the chaz of a shok. And so the Gemara says to that, no, if that was the only thing it's teaching us, in Kain, if so, lichtov krahi b'kadoshim lo sochel. It could have just said she can't eat kodshim. My betrumas hakadoshim. What is it adding the word truma, saying trumas hakadoshim? Shamat mina tarti. And that's really how we see both of these ideas. Again, we see this idea that if she has relations with somebody she is puzzled to, she cannot have truma. And so the Gemara continues, eshkechan kohenes. So now we have a source for a kohenes, as Rashi says, the mifsula l'truma bebias puzzle. We understand that that a kohenes, if she has relations with somebody she is puzzle to, she is now puzzle for truma. That we now have a source for. But Levia v'Yisraelis minolan, where do we know this idea that a Levia or Yisraelis, if they have relations with somebody they are puzzle to, that they become puzzle for kahuna? And to that the Gemara says, K'diyamar Rabbi Abba Amar Rav, it's like Rabbi Abba said in the name of Rav, Bas Ubas. So he darshaned, in another place, he darshaned the Vav, that it says Bas and it says Ubas. So Hachanami Bas Ubas. So too over here, we darshan the Vav, and that extra Vav, that teaches us the same halacha applies by a Levia and a Yisraelis. And the Gemara says, Keman, well, who does that follow? Rabbi Akiva, the Darish Vav, and it sounds like it's only following the position of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the one who darshans extra Vavs in the Torah. And the Gemara says, no, Afilu Tema Rabbanan, you could even say this follows the Rabbanan, Kulei Ubas Kro Yiseru. Really, the entire word Ubas is actually an extra word. Rashi over here says, Kulei Ubas Kro Yiseru Dochsiv Le'el Minei. It already says earlier, V'kohen ki yikne nefesh v'yilid beso, u'motzi l'mechtav abasrei, v'chisi el ishzar. It could just say, if she is with an ishzar. It doesn't have to say the word Ubas, and the fact that it says Ubas, talking about, again, the Bas Kohen kisi el ishzar, that entire word is extra, and therefore we can learn out from that word, again, that the same halacha would apply by a Levia and a Yisraelis. And the Gemara says, Eshkachon l'truma. Well, we understand that this is talking about truma, meaning these acts of relations passel them from truma when they have relations with somebody who they are puzzled to. But l'kahuna minolan, because the pasuk is talking about truma. But how do I know the halacha that they're not allowed to marry kohanim? As Rashi says, l'kahuna minolan shalotinasei l'kohen mishabah ale apostle. When she has relations with a apostle, how do we know she can no longer marry a kohen? Where do we understand that from? And so the Gemara answers, Atu levia v'Yisraelis lo l'kahuna marbinan lahu. Well, when we're talking about a levia and a Yisraelis, the whole halacha can only be true in terms of marrying a kohen, because they were never the ila truma. Because if we were talking about truma, benos mechal truma ninu, were they ever people who were allowed to eat truma? Of course, the Levi and the Israelis cannot eat truma anyway. So if there's any halacha being learned out of here, obviously is that the Levi and the Israelis are not allowed to marry a kohen, and so that's clear by Levi and the Israelis, and so that shows in general the halacha is if the woman has relations with somebody she's possible to, that she's not allowed to marry a kohen. But the Gemara says, is that really true? Alam alo. Why is it not possible? Isn't it possible that a Levi and Yisraelis were allowed to eat truma and they become pasul? How can it be true? Mashkachas lo deka'achla b'shvil b'na. You can have a simple case. She's eating the truma due to her son. Rashi over here says, Alam alo bitmi. It's a wonder. Of course you can have a case where a Levi and a Yisraelis are eating truma. V'mashkachas lo deka'achla b'shvil b'na. Let's say she has a situation where she had a son with a kohen. V'tzdarach lashmiran, and it's coming to teach us. Dimti boy lepasul lo teyasir, that because of her son she was allowed to eat truma, but if she then has relations with somebody she is puzzled to, then she can no longer eat the truma. So it is possible to have a case. So maybe again we're only talking about truma. Where's the source that she's not allowed to marry a kohen? And so the Gemara says to that, no, b'shvil b'na, in a situation where she's only eating because of her son, kal v'chomer, that we wouldn't even need a pasuk for. That we would know from a kal v'chomer. Uma kohenes, because if it's true by a kohenes, the v'kedusha de nafsha achla, where she's eating based on her own kedusha, and pasula, we say that if she has relations to somebody she's pasul to, that pasels her from truma. So levia v'Yisraelis, when it comes to a levia and Israelis, the lo achla ella b'shvil b'na, she's only eating because of her son, lo kol shekain, so certainly should it not be true, meaning it certainly should be true that she's going to be pasuk, so there's no need for the pasuk to teach us that, so that's why we have a pasuk available to say that they're also to marry a kohen. But the Gemara continues, vihi anosenes, that kal v'chomer, we can actually run that kal v'chomer the other direction and say on the contrary, kohenes, that when it comes to a kohenes, the kaddish gufa, where her own body is holy, so pasula, so there if she has relations with somebody that she's pasul to, that pasels her, that makes sense that she doesn't get truma. But when it comes to this case over here, a levia, a Yisraelis, who are only eating because of their sons, the lo kaddish guf, it's not because of the holiness in her own body, so lo pasala. So maybe we'll say over there that the act of relations with somebody that's pasul does not pasal her from truma, because the truma, the fact that she could eat truma, was never coming because of her own kedusha. And so the Gemara says instead, ella, rather lekahuna kal v'chomer migrusha. The way we know that by kahuna it's a problem, again, because that was the question over here. We understand the source that if they have relations with somebody they're pasul to, they're pasul for truma. But how do we know that if they have relations to somebody they're puzzled to, that they're also going to be puzzled to kahuna? That is a kal v'chomer from a grusha, from a divorcee. Uma grusha, because if it's true by a grusha, shamu teres b'truma, that a grusha is allowed to have truma, but asura lakuna, but a grusha is still asur to a kohen. So zu kedusha asura b'truma. In these cases where you have these women that they're asur in truma because of these acts of relations that they have had, eino din shepsula lekuna. Certainly, is it not true that they should be psula to kahuna? But the Gemara says, 1 second, v'chi mazhirin min adin. Are we allowed to issue a warning based on a kal v'chomer? Rashi says, v'chi mazhirin min adin midin kal v'chomer lu'ukme belav gomer. Now we're going to say a kal v'chomer and say that there's a real lav over here, that suddenly there's a lav that they're puzzled to kahuna based on a kal v'chomer. Hakay malan dein mazhirin min adin. There's a general rule in Makos. You're not allowed to issue a warning. You can't create an azhara. You can't create a lav from a kal v'chomer. And so to that, the Gemara says, no, Giloi Milso Bialmahu. This is not really an azhara from a kal v'chomer. It's just revealing to us the nature of the prohibition. Rashi over here says, Giloi Milso Bialmahu, V'lav Meilef Minei Alfinon, Lav LeKahuna Mitruma. We're not learning a lav to kahuna from truma. De Memela, Kevan de Ifsala LeTruma. What we're saying is, Memela, once we say these women are puzzle for truma, Ifsala LeKahuna, then also kahuna is included as well. The truma hainu Kedushas kahuna. Because truma and Kedushas kahuna are really the same thing. So we're not really creating a kal v'chomer over here. What we're really saying is, you see from this case that truma and kahuna really are the same thing. And the Gemara continues, Ve'ema nivala lepasal la chayve krisos. But maybe we should say that when we say that a woman has bia with somebody who she's pasal to, it has to be at the level that she's pasal as chayve krisos. As Rashi over here says, Ve'ema nivala lepasal la chayve krisos, shimbola acheha, let's say her brother has relations with her, so then pasal mi truma de bein nasha, then she would be pasal from truma from the house of her father. Aval chayve lavin, but let's say it's just chayve lavin, there's just a negative prohibition that she can't have relations with that person. Kevan de tavsi luba kidushe, since by chayve lavin kiddushin generally takes effect, so lo pasli la, so maybe there she wouldn't be pasal from truma. V'kusi u'nesinu mamzer de pasli minolan, so therefore by kusi and nesin mamzer, how do we know that that pasals her from truma and that those acts of relations pasal her from kahuna? And so to that the Gemara says, no, it can't just be chayve krisos, because kisihya amar rachmona. It says in the pasuk kisiya, a language of havaya, a language where kiddushin takes effect. So hanoch de isbu havaya, those situations where there is havaya, where there is kiddushin, chayve krisos la b'nei havaya. Chayve krisos is not talking about a situation by chayve krisos there is no kiddushin, the kiddushin doesn't take effect, and that's why we can understand that it applies to these cases as well. Rashi over here says, hanoch de isbu havaya mida afko lahach bia b'lashon havaya, from the fact that the act of relations is referred to with the language of havaya. Shma mina bevnei kiddushin mishtaikra. So it shows us that the pasuk is talking about people where the kiddushin takes effect. V'afilu hachi pasli, and nevertheless there's going to be a psul over here from kahuna, and there's going to be a psul over here from truma. But the Gemara continues, Ihachi, if so, if the pasuk is only talking about bnei havoya, so ovid kochavim v'evid lo lifsalu. If she has relations with a non-Jew or with an evid, that shouldn't passel her from truma. It shouldn't passel her from a kohen. Rashi over here says, Ihachi eimakra dafka bnei kiddushin nakat. Maybe it's only situations where the kiddushin takes effect and it's a pasal relationship that it passels. The ovid kochavim v'evid lo pasli. Maybe an ovid kochavim and an evid should not passel her. Vuadin dematzi nami lemer chayve krisos lo lifsli. The Gemara could have also asked that we should take the pasuk literally, and if she has relations with a chayve krisos, it shouldn't passel her. Elamishum da'ayri behula el de katani kusi hainu ovid kochavim. But since we already talked about kusi before, and that is an ovid kochavim of masnisin tanano evid posel mishum bi, and the Mishnah also talks about the fact that the evid passels. So that's why we ask specifically from ovid kochavim and from evid. And so the Gemara answers, Hanach pasli, no, those cases like an ovid kochavim and evid, the reason why those passel mid Rabbi Yishmael, that comes from what Rabbi Yishmael said. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Rabbi Yishmael, because Rabbi Yochanan said in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, Minayin lo ovid kochavim ve'evid shabal bas Yisrael. How do we know that if a non-Jew or an evid has relations with a bas Yisrael, v'al kohenes or levia, or has relations with a kohenes or a levia, shapaslua, that passels her, shenemar, that comes from a pasuk. The pasuk says, uvas kohen kisiya almono ugrusha v'gomer. It says if you have a bas kohen and she's a widow and a divorcee. And again, this pasuk is the pasuk that talks about the fact that if she's widowed or divorced and she returns to her father's house, then she returns and she can have truma. And we will see how this drasha plays out in the next video on Daf Samech Tes Amud Aleph.